Hello, English Survey A students. Last week, in week 3, we read the story The Sound of Thunder by Ray Bradbury. And we talked about one of the big themes in that story centering around the idea of the butterfly effect. And if you recall from last week, the butterfly effect is a name for the chaos theory. And basically, it says that sometimes one very small event can snowball and lead to something bigger. This week, I want you to take a close look at a poem that centers around that same theme. And in week 4, I want you to analyze this poem and tell me your reaction to it. Now, I know a lot of times when students are met with a new poem, they don't necessarily like it so much. I know sometimes poetry can be very challenging, but that's why I'm doing this little video to help you and show you some ways to analyze a poem. So when you come across a brand new poem and you're supposed to analyze it, or you want to figure out exactly what it's saying, the very first thing to do is just read the poem. And I always tell students to read through it several times and don't worry about trying to figure it all out at once. So just read through it and just focus in on the story. Try to figure out what's going on, but don't try and analyze it all at once. So let's start with that. The poem is called The Butterfly Effect by Richard Randolph. All actions have consequences, but inaction has consequences too. Every cruel act makes a crueler act more possible. Every kind act helps the recipient and enriches the giver. A boss insults a worker who goes home and berates his wife, who yells at the children, who feels compelled to abuse their dog, who bites the boss, or more likely, the innocent little girl next door. A canary dies and the experienced miner feels apprehensive. A butterfly dies and the world is less for it. Beneath apparent chaos, a complex order in which everything matters. Okay, so maybe you've already gotten a few ideas about this poem, or you have some reaction to it, but let's just take the next step here. And the next step when you are really looking closely at a poem is to go back through and pick out any words that you're not sure of. And again, reading poetry is challenging because their poems are usually very condensed, they're very short, and they're packing a lot of ideas into a very small space. So that's why it's super important to make sure you know what the words mean. So I'm just going to pick out a few words to take another look at here. So we have recipient and enriches. Let's start with those two. A recipient is somebody who gets something. They receive something. So if someone gives you a gift, you are the recipient. Enrich means to improve or enhance the quality of something. So people often talk about the events that enrich their lives. So when their first child is born, that can be an enriching experience, or making a new friend. Here's another word that might be unfamiliar. Berate. Berate means to scold or criticize. It's a negative word. None of us like to be berated. We don't like being criticized. Here's another one that might be less familiar. Compelled. Compel means to force or bring about something. You might feel compelled to help a little puppy that you see wandering by itself in the middle of the street. You might watch the nightly news and see hurricane victims, and you feel compelled to help them out in some way. So if you feel compelled, you feel forced to do something, or you want to take action. And here's another word. Chaos. Probably a lot of you know what that means. And if you happen to have taken my Myths and Legends class when you were in 9th grade, you'll recognize that this word comes from the Greek language. Chaos just means disorder or confusion. If you walk into the lunchroom in a middle school or junior high, it often looks like it's in complete chaos, right? Everybody's running around, maybe they're throwing food. That's an example of chaos. So these are some of the words that I saw that maybe were less familiar. If there's any others here that you're not sure of, you definitely want to make sure you define those before you start the analysis this week. Now, the next step is to take a look at some of the techniques that the author's using. In this poem, Richard Randolph, the poet, is using a few techniques to get his point across. Just like an artist learns different brush strokes and uses different colors to create their image, writers can do the same thing. So the big one that I wanted to point out first is used right in this line. And I'm going to type out what this is. This is a special technique called allusion, not illusion like a magician does, but allusion. And an allusion is referring to something, a person, a place, event, a character from a novel or a TV show that the writer assumes most of us know. And it's to help us make a connection. So allusions are kind of cool, but the problem is if you don't know what it's referring to, then they're kind of tricky. For example, if I said to somebody, "Oh, don't be such a Scrooge. Go ahead and donate money and help that cause." Or I might say, "Oh, when I put on that beautiful new dress, I felt just like Cinderella." So if you're familiar with the story A Christmas Carol, you know what it means if I call somebody a Scrooge, right? It means they're stingy and greedy. And if you're familiar with the story of Cinderella, you know that that's the story of this poor servant girl that's mistreated that all of a sudden becomes a princess, right? She's given a beautiful dress and goes to the ball. And so if somebody says they feel like Cinderella, you can understand how they might feel. So in this line, a canary dies and the experienced miner feels apprehensive. The only way this line makes sense is if you know what the canary in the coal mine means. And back before there were all the electronic devices and monitors that we have, it was said that coal miners would take a caged bird down into the mine with them, a lot of times a canary. And if the canary died, that was an early indication that something was wrong, that there was carbon monoxide in the mine or some other poisonous gases or lack of oxygen. So if the miners saw that, it would mean get out now. So the phrase canary in the coal mine has come to mean this early warning. So that's what they're referring to in that line. And then here's some other things to look at, techniques that the authors used that you might want to talk about in your analysis. Notice how, I'll use a different color for this here, the poet here is using repetition. Lots of words being repeated. So we repeat the word who, repeat the word consequences here. You can see that words are being used and reused a lot. Poets like to use this. Think about music. Think about one of your favorite songs. And think about the idea that a lot of times songs, music, uses repeated patterns. So if there's a song you really, really like, you might only need to hear a few notes of it, and you're like, oh, I know that song. Because that pattern's repeated, it creates that effect, it stays in your mind. Writers like to use this too. So notice how he plays it. All actions have consequences, but inaction has a consequence too. And then notice the next two lines, he repeats every. And then in the second stanza, the word who is repeated, so it shows this kind of chain that happens. So that's something else that you could talk about when you're analyzing this poem, is the techniques that he's used in writing this poem. So you can see that he's used allusion, and this writer has also used quite a bit of repetition. So there's a few things to look for when you're taking apart a poem, and some hints about things that you can write about. And as always, if you have questions or need help, please let me know, and we'll set a time to meet and collaborate and talk about it.